The sheets rustled, the sound almost deafening in the stillness. Her breath hitched, her body trembling as she pressed herself closer to him. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, gripped her hips with a possessiveness that sent shivers down her spine. She shouldn't be here. Shouldn't be doing this, but the ache inside her was too much to bear. 10 years of waiting, of hoping, of praying for him to wake up. And now she was here. In his hospital room, with his brother. Her husband lay in the bed, unmoving, his face pale and gaunt from a decade of unconsciousness. The machines around him beeped steadily, a cruel reminder of the life he had lost. She had come to visit him every year, every month, every week, but the hope that had once burned so brightly in her chest had faded to a dull ember. She was tired, so tired of waiting, of living in limbo. And so, when his brother had reached for her, she hadn't stopped him. She had let him pull her into his arms, let him kiss her, let him take her in the very room where her husband lay, trapped in a coma. The sound of the door creaking open made her freeze. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She turned her head, her eyes widening in horror as she saw him, her husband sitting up in bed, his eyes blazing with a fury that made her blood run cold. He was awake. After 10 long years, he was awake. 10 years earlier, the world had been a different place. He had been a different man, a veteran, a hero, a man who had dedicated his life to serving others. A soldier carved from the trials of conflict and forged in the crucible of duty. His name was Captain Daniel Harrow, a title earned through years of deployments in distant lands where the air tasted of dust and the horizon shimmered with heat. At 38, his face bore the lines of a life lived hard, creases around his hazel eyes from squinting against the sun, a jaw set firm beneath a short, salt and pepper beard. He was broad-shouldered, his frame still powerful despite the wear of time, a testament to the physical demands of his service. He had been on his way home from his latest deployment, an 8-month stretch in a war-torn region where every day was a negotiation with survival. When the call came in, it crackled through the static of his truck's old radio, a relic he'd kept running with duct tape and stubborn will. The voice on the other end was clipped. Urgent. All units, all available personnel, emergency at Lincoln Elementary. Bombing reported, multiple casualties, children trapped inside. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He was 20 miles out from his small hometown, the place he'd dreamed of returning to, a quiet house on a wooded lot, a cold beer on the porch, the chance to breathe without the weight of a rifle on his shoulder. But that vision evaporated in an instant. Without a second thought, he yanked the steering wheel hard, the tires of his battered Ford screeching as he swung the vehicle around on the empty highway. The engine growled as he floored the gas pedal, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The drive was a blur, the landscape streaking past in shades of gray and green, fields giving way to the outskirts of town. Then the first signs of civilization, a gas station, a diner, a row of modest homes. His mind raced faster than the truck, replaying the dispatcher's words, calculating what he might find. A bombing, a school, children. He'd seen destruction before, villages reduced to rubble, families torn apart, but this was different. This was home. This was sacred ground, a place where innocence was supposed to be untouchable. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady drumbeat of adrenaline and dread as he pushed the truck to its limits, the speedometer needle trembling past 90. He smelled the smoke before he saw it, a sharp, acrid tang that seeped through the cracked window and stung his nostrils. Then the horizon darkened, a plume of black rising against the pale March sky. Lincoln Elementary came into view, a low brick building that had stood for decades, its playground once filled with the laughter of kids chasing each other across the grass. Now it was a nightmare. Flames licked at the shattered windows, curling upward in hungry, orange tongues. The parking lot was a chaos of flashing lights, fire trucks, ambulances, police cruisers, their sirens wailing in a discordant symphony that clawed at his ears. A crowd had gathered beyond the hastily erected barricades, parents and onlookers, their faces pale with shock, some sobbing, others shouting into the void. Daniel slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop at the edge of the scene. He didn't bother with the door, vaulting out through the open window with the agility of a man half his age. His boots hit the asphalt, and he was moving, weaving through the throng of people, his eyes scanning the situation with the precision of a soldier trained to dissect chaos. The air was thick with smoke, a gray haze that burned his throat and blurred his vision. Debris littered the ground, chunks of concrete, shards of glass, a child's backpack torn open, its contents spilling across the pavement. The heat radiated in waves, a wall of searing energy that pressed against him as he neared the building. Firefighters in heavy gear shouted commands, their hoses arting water into the inferno, but the flames roared back, defiant and unrelenting. He could hear the screams now, faint but piercing, cutting through the din like a knife. Children. Inside, trapped. His gut twisted, a visceral ache that propelled him forward. A firefighter, a burly man with soot-streaked cheeks, grabbed his arm as he pushed past the line. "Sir, you can't go in there. It's too unstable." The man's voice was hoarse, strained with exhaustion, but Daniel shook him off with a force that surprised even himself. "I'm trained for this," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a lie. He'd run through hellscapes overseas, pulled wounded comrades from burning wrecks. But this was no battlefield. This was a school, a place where crayons and storybooks should have been the only tools of the day. The entrance loomed ahead, a gaping maw framed by jagged brick and twisted metal. Heat blasted his face as he crossed the threshold, the temperature soaring to a level that made his skin prickle and his lungs ache with every breath. The interior was a labyrinth of destruction, ceilings sagging, walls cracked, the floor strewn with overturned desks and broken chairs. Smoke hung heavy, a choking fog that reduced visibility to a few feet. He pulled his jacket over his mouth, squinting through the sting in his eyes, and listened. The cries were louder now, coming from deeper within. He moved fast, his boots crunching over glass and splintered wood, his body low to avoid the worst of the smoke that pooled higher up. The hallway stretched endlessly, each step a battle against the environment. The fire roared to his left, a wall of flame that devoured a row of lockers, their metal doors buckling under the heat. To his right, a classroom door hung off its hinges, revealing a scene of devastation: scorched books, a teacher's desk upended, a chalkboard smeared with ash. He pressed on, driven by the sound of those voices, small and desperate, calling out for rescue. His mind flashed to his own deployments, to the moments when he'd carried injured soldiers to safety, their blood soaking into his uniform. This was different, but the instinct was the same: protect, save, survive. He found them in the library, a cavernous room at the heart of the school. The shelves were toppled, books scattered like fallen leaves, some smoldering where embers had taken hold. In the far corner, beneath a window that had blown out, 10 children huddled together. Their faces were streaked with dirt and tears, their eyes wide with terror. 5 girls and 5 boys, no older than 8 or 9, clutching each other as the world burned around them. A little girl with pigtails sobbed uncontrollably, her hands pressed over her ears. A boy in a red hoodie stared at Daniel, his mouth open in a silent plea. The sight hit him like a physical blow, a raw, primal urge to shield them surging through him. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos, dropping to one knee to meet their level. "I'm here to get you out. Stay close to me." They nodded, some too shocked to speak, others reaching for him with trembling hands. He scooped up the smallest, a girl with a scraped knee and a torn dress, cradling her against his chest. "Hold on to each other," he instructed, and they obeyed, forming a ragged chain as he led them back toward the exit. The heat was unbearable now, a furnace that pressed down on them, sweat soaking through his shirt and dripping into his eyes. The smoke thickened, a black curtain that threatened to swallow them whole, but he kept moving, his arm outstretched to feel his way along the wall. The flames were closer now, licking at the edges of the hallway, the structure groaning under the strain. A beam crashed down behind them, sending sparks flying, and eliciting shrieks from the children. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice raw, pushing them forward as he shielded them with his body. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed for clean air, but he didn't stop. He could see the entrance ahead, a faint rectangle of daylight through the haze, so close yet impossibly far. The children clung to him, their small hands gripping his uniform, their trust in him, absolute. He had almost made it. Almost. They were 10 feet from freedom when the second explosion ripped through the building. It came from below, a deep, guttural roar that shook the earth and shattered the air. The force threw him forward, his body twisting instinctively to protect the children as they were hurled through the doorway. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs, his head cracking against the pavement. Pain exploded behind his eyes, a white-hot burst that blurred his vision. The children's cries echoed in his ears, faint and distant now, their hands slipping from his grasp as darkness crept in. He tried to move, to call out. But his body wouldn't obey. The last thing he felt was the weight of their trust, the heat of the flames, and then, nothing. Outside, the world erupted into motion, firefighters rushing forward, paramedics shouting, the children pulled to safety one by one. Daniel lay motionless, his uniform singed and torn, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The school burned on, a monument to his sacrifice, as the crowd watched in stunned silence. 10 years earlier, he had been a different man. Now he was something more, a hero defined not by medals or rank, but by the lives he'd saved in that final, desperate act. So when he woke up, it was to the sterile white walls of a hospital room, a stark, antiseptic prison that smelled faintly of bleach and despair. The beeping of the heart monitor pierced the silence first, its steady mechanical rhythm a jarring counterpoint to the chaos that still roared in his fragmented memories. Flames licking at his skin, children's cries echoing in his ears, the deafening blast that had torn him from the world. His name was Captain Daniel Harrow, a soldier who had survived wars only to be felled by a single selfless act, and now he lay in a bed that felt more like a tomb. He tried to move, to shift even a finger, but his body was an unresponsive slab, heavy as lead, betraying the will that still burned within him. Panic surged through his chest, a wild, clawing thing, as he realized the full extent of his entrapment. He couldn't speak, couldn't force his eyelids to flutter open, couldn't break free from the suffocating darkness that held him captive. He was a prisoner in his own flesh, suspended in a void where time and sensation twisted into an endless nightmare. The hospital room became his universe, a confined space defined by the sounds and smells that filtered through his unyielding coma. The heart monitor's beep was a metronome to his existence, each pulse a reminder that he was alive, if only barely. Beyond it, he heard the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on linoleum, the occasional clatter of a tray, the murmured voices of doctors discussing charts and prognosis in clipped, clinical tones. The air was cool against his skin, a sterile breeze from the vent above his bed, carrying with it the faint tang of iodine and latex. Tubes snaked into his body, he could feel their alien presence, though he couldn't see them. One in his arm, delivering fluids, another in his nose, feeding him oxygen. A third somewhere lower, handling the indignities his body could no longer manage on its own. He wanted to scream, to rip them out, to demand answers, but his voice was locked away, his muscles frozen in a betrayal he couldn't comprehend. Days bled into weeks, a slow, relentless march, measured only by the shifting patterns of sound and touch. He learned to recognize the nurses by their habits. One hummed softly under her breath, a tuneless melody that grated on his nerves. Another moved with brisk efficiency, her hands cool and impersonal as she adjusted his IV or turned his body to prevent sores. The doctors came less often, their visits marked by the rustle of clipboards and the weight of their words, phrases like persistent vegetative state and minimal brain activity drifting through his haze, each one a dagger to his fading hope. He clung to the fragments of his last moments, the heat of the fire, the weight of the children in his arms, replaying them obsessively, as if they could anchor him to the man he'd been before the explosion stole everything. His wife, Emily, was his lifeline in that endless dark. She came every day at first, her presence a beacon he could sense even through the fog of his condition. Her voice was soft, familiar, a thread of warmth that wove through the cold sterility of the room. She'd sit beside him, her chair creaking faintly as she settled in and take his hand in hers, her fingers small and delicate against his calloused palm, her wedding ring a cool pressure against his skin. He couldn't see her, but he pictured her as she'd been, 35, with auburn hair that fell in loose waves to her shoulders, green eyes that crinkled when she smiled, a face that had weathered his deployments with quiet strength. Now her voice trembled as she spoke, a mix of determination and desperation, as if she could will him back to her. "Daniel, it's me," she'd say, her words a ritual that grounded him. "I'm here. You're still here with me, I know it." She'd talk for hours, filling the silence with stories of their life together. Their first date at a county fair, where he'd won her a stuffed bear by knocking down a pyramid of cans. The house they'd bought, a fixer-upper with a porch swing he'd promised to repair. The dreams they'd spun late at night, of kids and travel and a quiet retirement. She'd tell him about the world outside, the small town still reeling from the bombing, the 10 children he'd saved now safe with their families, their parents sending cards and flowers that piled up unread in the corner of his room. "They call you a hero, Dan," she'd whisper, her voice breaking. "You should hear them, the medals, the honors. They're waiting for you. Just come back to me." Her touch was his only tether, her hand squeezing his with a fierceness that belied her gentle tone. Sometimes she'd stroke his cheek, her fingertips tracing the lines of his face, lingering on the scar above his left eyebrow from a shrapnel wound years ago. Other times she'd rest her forehead against his, her breath warm and uneven, and he'd feel the dampness of her tears on his skin. He fought to respond, to twitch a finger, to blink, to give her some sign that he was still there, still hearing her, still loving her. But his body remained a traitor, silent and still, and the frustration gnawed at him, a relentless ache that matched the phantom pain of his injuries. Weeks stretched into months, the seasons shifting beyond the window he couldn't see. Spring brought the scent of rain through the cracked pane, summer the hum of a fan that stirred the stifling air. Fall the rustle of leaves carried on a breeze. Emily's visits remained constant, a daily pilgrimage that structured his formless days. She'd read to him sometimes dog-eared paperbacks she'd loved, newspapers with headlines he couldn't process, or play music from a portable speaker. Old country songs they'd dance to in their kitchen. She'd tell him about her job at the library, the mundane details of shelving books and helping kids with homework, her attempt to keep life normal despite the void he'd left. Each word was a lifeline, each touch a promise, and he clung to them with everything he had. But time is a cruel thief, and as months turned to years, the cracks in her resolve began to show. Her voice grew quieter, the stories shorter, the silences longer. He could hear the exhaustion in her, the way her sentences trailed off, the way her hand trembled when it held his. She was 38 now, then 40, then 42, and the hope that had once blazed in her, a fire he'd felt even without seeing her eyes, began to dim. She'd still talk about the children he'd saved, now growing up, their lives a testament to his sacrifice, the girl with pigtails who wanted to be a doctor, the boy in the red hoodie who wrote him a letter every year. She'd mention the medals, the Purple Heart, the Medal of Valor, gathering dust in a box at home, the ceremonies she'd attended alone. But the weariness crept in, a shadow that darkened her words, and she was tiring of the limbo, of loving a ghost. The visits became less frequent, a shift he felt like a physical wound. Daily turned to every other day, then twice a week, then once. The nurses filled the gaps with their routines, but their presence was a poor substitute for Emily's. He'd lie there, counting the beeps of the monitor, straining for the sound of her footsteps, the creak of her chair, the warmth of her hand. When she did come, her voice was hollow, her touch fleeting. "I miss you, Dan," she'd say, and he'd hear the unspoken goodbye in it, the weight of a life she couldn't pause forever. She was fading from him, pulled back into the world of the living, and he couldn't blame her, though it tore at him all the same. Then, one day, she stopped coming altogether. The silence was deafening, a void deeper than the coma itself. He didn't know the date, time had long since lost meaning, but he felt the absence like a severed limb. The nurses didn't mention her. Their voices hushed when they spoke near his bed, and he wondered if she'd finally let go, if she'd found a way to move on from the man who couldn't return to her. The room grew colder, the beeps more mechanical, the darkness more absolute. He was alone now, a hero trapped in a body that had failed him, a husband abandoned by the life he'd fought to reclaim. 10 years had passed since that day at the school, and the world had moved on without him, leaving him to drift in the wreckage of his own sacrifice. It had started innocently enough, a quiet ripple in the stagnant pool of her existence, a moment that crept up on her with the subtlety of a shadow lengthening at dusk. Emily Harrow had spent years tethered to the hospital room where her husband, Captain Daniel Harrow, lay ensnared in a coma, a silent sentinel of a life interrupted. The room had become her second home, its sterile white walls and the ceaseless beep of the heart monitor, as familiar as the lines on her own face. She was 42 now, her auburn hair streaked with the first threads of gray, her green eyes dulled by a decade of waiting, of hoping, of grieving a man who was neither fully gone nor truly present. She had borne the weight of that limbo with a stoic grace, but beneath it, she was crumbling, a woman hollowed out by loneliness and the relentless march of time. Daniel's brother, Michael, had been a constant in those years, a steady presence who bridged the gap between the past and the unbearable present. At 39, he was a younger, rougher version of Daniel, same broad shoulders, same hazel eyes, though his were unlined by the scars of war. His hands calloused from carpentry rather than combat. He'd always been the softer of the two, the one who stayed behind while Daniel deployed, the one who built things instead of tearing them down. Michael had visited Daniel faithfully, week after week, sitting by his bedside with a quiet reverence, filling the silence with stories of their childhood, fishing trips on the lake, the time they'd built a treehouse that collapsed under their teenage weight, the pranks they'd pulled on their stern father. Emily had come to rely on those visits, not just for Daniel's sake, but for her own, a tether to a world that hadn't stopped spinning while she stood still. That day, the air in the room felt different, charged with an undercurrent she couldn't name. It was a crisp October afternoon. The window cracked open to let in the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of traffic. The hospital was quieter than usual, the hallways hushed, the nurse's footsteps a faint echo beyond the door. Michael arrived as he always did, carrying a thermos of coffee and a worn paperback, some Western novel he'd been reading aloud to Daniel, his voice a low rumble that filled the space. He settled into the chair beside the bed, his flannel shirt brushing against the armrest, and began to talk. "Remember that summer we camped out by the river, Dan? You caught that trout with your bare hands, damn near wrestled it into the boat. Was so mad when we tracked mud all over her kitchen." His laugh was soft, tinged with nostalgia, and Emily, standing by the window, felt it stir something deep within her, a pang of longing for a life that seemed impossibly distant. She tried to focus on the mundane, adjusting the blanket over Daniel's still form, checking the IV line that snaked into his arm, but her skin prickled, a restless energy coiling in her chest. Michael's presence was too close, too warm, a contrast to the cold sterility that had defined her days. She'd been alone for so long, a decade without the weight of Daniel's arms around her, without the brush of his lips against hers, without the simple comfort of a body beside her in the night. The ache had grown over the years, a quiet, gnawing thing she'd buried beneath routine and duty, but now it clawed its way to the surface, raw and insistent. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining the shift in the air, the way Michael's eyes lingered on her a beat too long, when she turned to face him. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking the rhythm of his storytelling, and she froze, her hand still resting on Daniel's wrist, feeling the faint pulse beneath her fingers. She looked up, and there it was, a tension in his gaze, a question unspoken but palpable. He set the book down, his movements slow, deliberate, and stood, closing the small distance between them. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, the beep of the monitor a metronome to the sudden thudding of her heart. She should have stepped back, should have turned away, but her feet were rooted to the floor, her breath catching as he reached for her. His hand brushed her arm, tentative at first, then firmer, and she didn't stop him. She couldn't. The ache inside her was too much to bear, a dam breaking under the weight of years. And when he pulled her into his arms, she let him. His embrace was solid, grounding, a stark contrast to the ghost of Daniel's touch that haunted her memories. Michael smelled of sawdust and coffee, his flannel rough against her cheek, his breath warm against her hair. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could pretend it was Daniel, pretend the last 10 years hadn't happened, pretend she wasn't drowning in a sea of solitude. Then his lips found hers. Hesitant at first, a question pressed into the kiss, and she answered with a desperation she hadn't known she carried. Her hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, and he deepened the kiss, a hunger in it that matched her own. The room faded, the beeping monitor, the sterile walls, the man lying motionless mere feet away, until it was just them, a collision of need and grief and forbidden want. He guided her back, her hips bumping against the edge of the narrow table by the window, and she didn't resist as he lifted her onto it. The cold metal a shock against her skin through her jeans, her fingers tangled in his hair, his hands sliding under her sweater, tracing the curve of her spine with a reverence that made her shiver. It was wrong, so wrong, and yet it felt like salvation, a fleeting reprieve from the prison of her loyalty. They moved together in a frantic, silent dance, the rustle of clothing and the hitch of their breaths, the only sounds beyond the relentless beep of Daniel's monitor. She let him take her there, in that very room, her husband's presence a shadow over them, his still form a silent witness to her betrayal. The act was quick, urgent, a release of years of pent-up longing, and when it was over, they clung to each other, panting, the weight of what they'd done settling like a stone between them. The guilt crashed over her immediately, a tidal wave that stole the air from her lungs and pressed down on her chest with crushing force. She slid off the table, her legs trembling, and stumbled back, her hands fumbling to straighten her clothes. Michael reached for her, his face etched with a mix of regret and pleading, but she shook her head, tears blurring her vision. She whispered, the word ragged, barely audible over the hum of the machines. She turned to Daniel, his face unchanged, his chest rising and falling in the same mechanical rhythm, and the reality of her actions clawed at her. She had betrayed him. Daniel, the man who had run into a burning school, who had given everything to save others, who had loved her with a quiet, unshakable devotion. She had shattered their vows, their trust in a moment of weakness, and there was no undoing it. Michael said her name, soft and broken, but she couldn't look at him. She grabbed her coat from the chair, her movements jerky, and fled the room, the door swinging shut behind her with a muted thud. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the fluorescent lights harsh against her tear-streaked face, the antiseptic smell choking her as she ran. She didn't stop until she reached the parking lot, the cold October air biting at her skin, the sky a dull gray that mirrored the storm inside her. She collapsed against her car, sobs wrenching from her throat, her hands pressed to her mouth, as if she could shove the guilt back inside. In the days that followed, she couldn't face the hospital. She stayed away, locked in their house, the house Daniel had promised to fix, where the porch swing still creaked on rusty chains, replaying the moment over and over. The feel of Michael's hands, the taste of his kiss, the sound of Daniel's monitor in the background, it haunted her, a relentless loop of shame. She saw Michael's truck in the driveway once, heard his knock at the door, but she didn't answer, couldn't bear to see the mirror of her own guilt in his eyes. She had betrayed the man who had given his life to save others, and the weight of it was a punishment she'd carry forever, a stain no amount of tears could wash away. The hospital room remained silent, Daniel trapped in his coma, oblivious to the fracture and the world he'd left behind, while Emily drowned in the wreckage of her own making. The sound of the door creaking open sliced through the stillness of the hospital room like a blade, a slow, deliberate groan that made Emily Harrow freeze mid-step. Her heart slammed against her ribcage, a frantic, erratic thudding that drowned out the soft hum of the machines surrounding her husband's bed. Her breath came in short, panic gasps rasping in her throat as she stood rooted to the cold linoleum floor, her coat still clutched in her trembling hands. She'd returned after days of absence, driven by a gnawing guilt that had festered in the quiet of their empty home. A guilt born of her betrayal with Michael, Daniel's brother, in this very room. She'd come to confess, to whisper her shame to the unconscious man she'd vowed to honor, hoping somehow his silence could absolve her. But now, as the door's hinges whined, a primal instinct screamed that something was wrong, terribly wrong. She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff with dread, and her eyes widened in horror, a gasp catching in her chest as the impossible unfolded before her. There he was, Captain Daniel Harrow, her husband, sitting upright in the bed where he'd lain motionless for a decade. His broad shoulders, once slumped in perpetual stillness, were taut with tension, his hospital gown hanging loose over a frame that had withered but still bore the echoes of his soldier strength. His face, pale and gaunt from years of immobility, was alive with a fury that blazed in his hazel eyes, a molten fire that seemed to sear through the dim light of the room. He was awake. After 10 long years trapped in the prison of his coma, he was awake, and the sight of him alert aware, alive, sent a shiver of terror and disbelief coursing through her veins, turning her blood to ice. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the world contracting to the space between them. The room was a frozen tableau, the sterile white walls streaked with faint shadows, the window framing a gray October sky. The tangle of tubes and wires still tethered to Daniel's body like the remnants of a cocoon he'd just shed. The heart monitor beeped on, its rhythm steady and indifferent, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting within her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, her mind reeling as it struggled to reconcile the man before her with the ghost she'd mourned for a decade. His gaze locked onto hers, piercing and unyielding, and in it she saw not just recognition, but something darker, rage, betrayal, a storm brewing behind those eyes she'd once known so well. The silence shattered with a roar, a guttural bellow of rage that tore from Daniel's throat as he surged to his feet. The movement was sudden, explosive, defying the atrophy that should have bound him to the bed. Tubes ripped free from his arms. The IV stand crashing to the floor with a metallic clang, fluids pooling in a glistening smear across the linoleum. Emily stumbled back, her coat slipping from her grasp, her breath hitching as he lunged, not at her but past her, toward the door. It swung wider, revealing Michael standing there, his own face a mask of shock, the thermos of coffee he'd brought slipping from his hand to shatter on the floor. The brothers' eyes met, and in that instant, Emily understood. Daniel knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew what had happened between her and Michael, the sin they'd committed in this sacred space. The fight erupted with a brutality that turned the room into a battlefield. Daniel, fueled by a decade of pent-up fury, threw himself at Michael with a force that belied his weakened state. His fists, still bearing the scars of war, swung with lethal precision, slamming into Michael's chest, his jaw, his ribs. Michael, caught off guard, staggered back, his carpenter's hands rising too late to defend himself. "Dan, stop," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But Daniel was beyond words, a tempest of anger and betrayal unleashed. The room became a chaos of motion, chairs toppling, the bedside table overturning, medical equipment clattering as the brothers grappled. Emily screamed, her voice lost in the cacophony, her hands pressed to her mouth as she watched in helpless horror. Daniel drove Michael back against the wall, the impact rattling the framed certificates that hung there, one crashing to the floor in a spray of glass. Michael fought back, his fists connecting with Daniel's shoulder, his cheek, but he was no match for the soldier's ferocity. Blood bloomed on Michael's lip, a crimson streak against his paling skin, and his breaths came in ragged gasps as Daniel pinned him, one hand closing around his throat. "You bastard," Daniel snarled, his voice rough and raw from disuse. Each word a jagged shard of pain. "My own brother." Michael's eyes widened, pleading, but Daniel's grip tightened, his other fist slamming into Michael's face with a sickening crunch. The struggle was primal, visceral, a clash of flesh and bone that echoed with the weight of their shared history. Brothers bound by blood, now severed by betrayal. Emily lunged forward, her hands grasping at Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Daniel, stop, please," she cried, tears streaming down her face. But he shook her off with a force that sent her sprawling to the floor, her elbow cracking against the linoleum. She scrambled back, her vision blurring as the fight reached its brutal climax. Michael's strength faltered, his arms flailing weakly, and with a final savage blow, Daniel drove his fist into his brother's temple. Michael's body went limp, sliding down the wall in a heap, his head lolling to one side, blood pooling beneath him on the floor. The room fell silent, save for the ragged heaving of Daniel's chest and the relentless beep of the monitor, now erratic with his exertion. Daniel stood over Michael's lifeless form, his hands trembling, his knuckles raw and bloodied. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven bursts, his eyes wild with a mix of triumph and despair. A man who had reclaimed something only to lose everything in the process. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood, the acrid tang of spilled coffee, the faint hum of the hospital beyond the door oblivious to the carnage within. Emily stared at the scene, her mind a whirlwind of shock and grief, her body frozen against the wall where she'd fallen. Michael was gone, dead at the hands of the brother he'd betrayed, the brother she'd betrayed, and the weight of it crushed her. A suffocating realization that she had ignited this fire. Daniel turned to her then, his gaze shifting from the body at his feet to the woman cowering before him. His eyes, once warm with love, now burned with an accusation that pierced her to her core. Blood streaked his face, a gash above his brow dripping crimson down his cheek. But he stood tall, a towering figure of wrath reborn. For the first time in 10 years he spoke to her, his voice a gravelly rasp, strained from a throat unused but dripping with venom. "You," he said, the single word a condemnation that echoed in the hollow of her chest. "You betrayed me." The accusation hung between them, heavy and unanswerable, a truth she couldn't deny. She stared at him, her mouth open but silent, her heart fracturing as the depth of her actions crashed over her. She saw him now. Not just the hero who'd saved 10 children, not just the husband she'd mourned, but the man she'd wounded in a way no explosion ever could. His face twisted with pain, not from the fight, but from the betrayal that had awakened him. A wound deeper than any physical scar. She'd lost him, not to the coma that had stolen a decade, but to her own weakness, her moment of surrender to Michael's touch in this very room. Under the shadow of Daniel's sacrifice. The room seemed to close in, the walls a cage of her own making. Daniel's chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment she thought he might strike her too, that his rage would consume them both. But he didn't move, didn't speak again, just stood there. A statue of judgment, his eyes boring into hers with a mix of anguish and disgust. She wanted to explain, to beg forgiveness, to tell him it had been a mistake born of loneliness and despair. But the words choked in her throat, useless against the reality of Michael's body on the floor, and the fury in Daniel's gaze. She slid down the wall, her legs giving out, her sobs breaking free in wrenching gasps. The heart monitor beeped on, a cruel reminder of life persisting amidst death, and beyond the door, footsteps approached. Nurses, doctors, drawn by the noise, their voices rising in alarm as they entered the shattered room. Daniel didn't flinch as they rushed in, didn't resist, as hands pulled him back, restraining him with shouts and questions he didn't answer. Emily watched through tears as they covered Michael's body, as they led Daniel away, his eyes never leaving hers until he was gone from sight. She was alone then, surrounded by the wreckage of her choices. Michael dead, Daniel awake but lost to her forever. The guilt was a living thing, clawing at her insides, and she knew there was no going back, no redemption for the betrayal that had destroyed them all. 10 years had passed since the bombing, but this moment was her true undoing, the end of the life she'd clung to, now buried beneath the weight of her own weakness. The days that followed Daniel Harrow's awakening were a relentless blur. A storm of chaos that swept through the hospital and beyond, engulfing everything in its path. The sterile confines of the room where he'd lain comatose for a decade became a crime scene overnight, cordoned off with yellow tape, the air thick with the metallic tang of Michael's blood, and the shattered remnants of a life once held together by fragile threads. Emily Harrow sat in the aftermath, auburn-haired, disheveled, her green eyes hollowed by tears and sleeplessness, as the world descended upon them. The police arrived first, their boots heavy on the linoleum, their voices clipped and authoritative as they demanded answers she couldn't fully give. "What happened here, Mrs. Harrow?" they asked, pens poised over notebooks, faces stern beneath the brims of their caps. She stammered through the story, Daniel waking, the fight, Michael's death, each word a shard of glass in her throat, her hands trembling as she clutched a styrofoam cup of cold coffee a nurse had pressed into her grip. The media followed, like vultures, their cameras flashing through the hospital windows, their microphones thrust toward anyone who'd speak. Headlines blazed across screens and newspapers within hours. Hero turned killer, veteran awakens from decade-long coma, murders brother. The story was a wildfire, spreading through the small town and beyond, igniting debates that crackled across airwaves and social media. Daniel Harrow, the man who'd stormed into a burning school to save 10 children, was now a paradox. A hero stained with blood, a savior branded a monster. Some saw him as a victim, a man betrayed in the most intimate way, his rage a justified eruption after years of helplessness. He woke up to find his wife and brother had desecrated everything he fought for. One pundit argued on a late-night talk show, his voice ringing with conviction. Others condemned him without mercy, their words sharp as knives, A hero doesn't kill his own kin, no matter the provocation. He's a beast unleashed. The world was divided. A cacophony of opinions swirling around a man who'd once been a symbol of selflessness, now reduced to a lightning rod for outrage and pity. For Daniel, though, there was no debate, no gray area to navigate. He sat in the hospital's holding room, a stark windowless box with a single metal table, his wrists cuffed, his bloodied knuckles resting on his lap. The fury that had consumed him in those first waking moments had settled into a cold, unyielding certainty. He had done what he had to do. Michael's betrayal, Emily's infidelity. They were wounds deeper than the explosion that had stolen a decade of his life, and his brother's death was the price of that treachery. He didn't speak when the detectives pressed him, didn't flinch as they recounted the brutality of the fight. The fractured skull, the lifeless body sprawled across the floor. His hazel eyes, still sharp despite years of disuse, stared straight ahead, fixed on some invisible point beyond the concrete walls. "I'd do it again," he rasped finally, his voice a gravelly whisper, the only words he'd offer before falling silent once more. To him it wasn't murder, it was justice, a reckoning for a wound that no metal or honor could heal. Emily tried to reach him, driven by a desperate need to explain, to apologize, to claw back some fragment of the man she'd loved. She haunted the hospital corridors, her coat draped over her shoulders like a shroud, her face pale and drawn as she waited for a chance to see him. The police had barred her from the holding room at first, but she persisted, pleading with a young officer, whose pity finally won out. When they let her in, the sight of Daniel upright, awake, alive nearly broke her again. He sat there, his hospital gown replaced by a gray jumpsuit, his broad frame hunched slightly, his hands still stained with faint traces of blood despite the hasty cleaning. She stepped forward, her breath hitching, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Daniel, please. I need you to hear me. It was a mistake. A moment. I was so alone, so lost without you. I never meant to hurt you." He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the tears streaming down her cheeks, or the way her hands reached out, hovering in the air between them. The betrayal was a chasm too vast, too raw, its edges jagged with the memory of Michael's hands on her, the act played out in the shadow of his comatose body. "Daniel, I'm sorry," she whispered, sinking to her knees beside the table, her fingers brushing the cold metal as if it could bridge the gap. "Please, say something, yell at me, hate me, anything. Just don't shut me out." He couldn't listen, couldn't bear the sound of her voice weaving excuses around a truth that had shattered him. The wound was too fresh, a gaping hole where trust and love had once lived, and her words were salt rubbed into it, unbearable in their futility. He turned his head away, his jaw clenched, and the silence between them was a wall she couldn't breach. The hospital became a prison of its own for both of them in those days. Daniel held under guard, Emily trapped by her guilt, and the relentless scrutiny of the world outside. Reporters camped in the parking lot, their vans a barricade of satellite dishes and flashing lights, shouting questions whenever she emerged. "Mrs. Harrow, did you know he'd wake up? Did you drive him to this?" She shielded her face with her scarf, her steps unsteady as she fled to her car, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her already fractured spirit. At home, the phone rang incessantly. Friends, strangers, journalists, until she unplugged it, retreating to the quiet of the living room, where Daniel's medals still sat in a box, gathering dust beside a photo of their wedding day. She stared at it, her younger self smiling beside a man whose eyes had once held only warmth, and wondered how they'd come to this. In the end, Daniel left. It happened abruptly. The decision born in the dead of night after the police, overwhelmed by the media circus and the complexity of his case, transferred him to a temporary holding facility pending charges. The details were murky. Some said a sympathetic guard looked the other way, others that he'd simply walked out when a door was left unsecured. But by morning, he was gone. He slipped out of the hospital, out of the system, out of her life, leaving behind the jumpsuit folded neatly on a bench, and a trail that vanished into the cold October air. The authorities searched, of course. Patrols scoured the town. Helicopters buzzed overhead. But Daniel was a soldier trained in evasion, a ghost who knew how to disappear. He took nothing with him, no money, no clothes, just the weight of his pain and the memory of what he'd lost. Emily never saw him again, but his absence was a presence that haunted her every day. The house grew quieter, the porch swing creaking in the wind, the rooms filling with shadows that seemed to carry his shape. She didn't leave town, not when it held the last echoes of him. But she withdrew, a recluse in a life that no longer fit. The media frenzy faded with time, the world moving on to new scandals, but the story lingered in the town like a scar. The hero who'd saved 10 children, who'd awakened to kill his brother, who'd vanished into the ether. Some whispered he'd gone north, to the woods where he'd once hunted with Michael. Others swore they'd seen him in distant cities, a drifter with a soldier's gait. Emily didn't know, didn't search, because the truth was unbearable. He was gone, and she'd driven him away. She never forgot him, though. He remained etched in her mind. A man who'd given everything to save others, who'd run into flames without hesitation, who'd loved her with a quiet, steady strength. The medals stayed in their box, the photo on the shelf, relics of a life destroyed, not by the explosion that had taken his body, but by the betrayal of the people he'd loved most. Michael's death was her fault, Daniel's rage her creation, and the guilt was a companion she'd carry forever. She'd lost him. Not to the coma, not to the fire, but to her own weakness. A moment of surrender that had unraveled them all. And as the years stretched on, she lived with that truth. A widow to a man who still walked the earth. A prisoner to a past she could never escape. Years passed, and the world moved on. The bombing became a distant memory, the hero who had saved the children a legend. But for her, the pain never faded. She lived with the guilt, the regret, the knowledge that she had betrayed the man she loved. She visited his grave, every year on the anniversary of the day he had woken up. She would sit by the headstone, her hand resting on the cold stone, and talk to him. She would tell him about her life, about the children he had saved, about the legacy he had left behind. She would apologize, over and over again, for what she had done. But he was gone, and there was no bringing him back. She had lost him, not just to the coma, but to her own weakness. And now she had to live with the consequences. In the end, it was the children who saved her. The 10 children he had rescued, now grown, came to her one day. They had heard the story, the truth about what had happened, and they wanted to thank her. They told her that he had been a hero, a man who had given everything to save them, and that she had been a part of that. They didn't blame her for what had happened. They understood the pain, the loneliness, the desperation that had driven her to betray him. And they forgave her. It was a small comfort, but it was enough. She had lost him, but she had not lost everything. She had the children, the legacy he had left behind, and the knowledge that in the end, he had been a hero, and that was enough. She stood by his grave one last time, her hand resting on the cold stone. The wind blew through the trees, the sound of the leaves rustling a gentle reminder of the life that continued on. She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall, and whispered the words she had been too afraid to say before. And then she turned and walked away, leaving the past behind her. She had lost him, but she had found herself, and that was enough.